remind you that for more Microsoft Webcasts, you can go to Microsoft.com/webcasts. Thanks again for joining us for today's MSDN Webcast, Developing Rich Solutions in Silverlight for SharePoint 2010. It's now my pleasure to hand it over to your presenter, Bob German. Bob, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I want to thank everyone who's joined us today. Looking forward to doing the presentation for you. We're going to be discussing a topic that I really enjoy working with, which is how to develop great solutions in Silverlight for SharePoint 2010. And what we're going to be discussing really is kind of a combination of things. We're going to start off with really an introduction to Silverlight in SharePoint. So for those who are new to Silverlight or SharePoint, we'll be level setting a little bit, as well as I'm going to start with like a blank project, a completely blank sheet, and show you actually how to get started doing this work in Visual Studio 2010. Then from there, we're going to get into some best practices and some more different coding styles. And so I'll be showing you how to reduce round trips to the server using the HTML bridge for Silverlight, something that may be important for anyone working in a high-volume server environment where you don't want to incur extra server traffic from the Silverlight controls. We're also going to look at how to work with large data sets. So what do you do if you have more data than you really want to download and let the user interact with that data using a Silverlight application. Then I'll show you how to build a Silverlight field control, which can be used in a web content management context. These are also useful if you just want to create a new data type for any list in SharePoint and use Silverlight to show and edit that field. And then finally, I'll show you how to create web part connections with Silverlight. In this exercise, we'll actually use the server-side connection mechanism that users are familiar with in web parts, and we'll actually use that to connect directly on the client side multiple Silverlight applications so that we get a real-time update without having to refresh the page. So this is the first step towards building mashups using this technology. So to sort of start out, I guess, at the beginning, I'm just going to point out that SharePoint, amazing as it is and all the different things that it does, is really just an ASP.NET application that uses SQL Server. It uses standard web protocols. It runs on top of ASP.NET. And as such, really anything that you can do in a web server, like put a plugin on the page, you can do in SharePoint. So from that point of view, it's pretty straightforward to work with Silverlight in a SharePoint environment. Silverlight itself is a browser plugin. I say mostly because we have out-of-browser support now, but basically it's primarily still a browser plugin that runs cross-browser and cross-platform. So it's going to work the same on a Mac using Safari or on Windows using Firefox or Internet Explorer, and it can save a lot of time in testing and developing solutions that are cross-browser and cross-platform. Your application runs in a sandbox with a subset of the .NET runtime, so that the kind of programming that you've been doing, if you're a .NET developer, is going to be very familiar. And it can also interact with the network and the web browser directly, so that you can get to anything that's on the web page, the JavaScript environment, etc., or you can do network calls back to your web server. So why are we talking about this? What's so interesting about building a Silverlight UI? Well, I already mentioned that it's easier to build and test, certainly compared with Ajax-style coding, where you have so there's technologies that help to isolate you from the browser, from the specifics of each browser, but you still have a lot of testing to do, and you can still get little glitches in different browsers. I also mentioned the familiar .NET semantics. Another thing is that it's great in a similar way to HTML in separating the design from the coding effort. So your design work can be done by a professional designer and then hand it over to someone to develop the code that backs it up and gives it behaviors, as compared with traditional application development where you might start with a bitmap representation of what the screen's supposed to look like and then have to somehow reproduce that. This is the same technology that's used in Windows Presentation Foundation. And also, of course, we have Visual Studio working for us here as a common development environment and debugging platform for both SharePoint and Silverlight. So it's very powerful. Animations, media, deep zoom, data binding, all kinds of things are available there. And we have lots of rich client integration, including the HTML bridge, which we'll see today, out-of-browser support, potentially storing things in Silverlight's own file store, or getting to the multi-touch UI. So we're not going to have time to touch on all those things today, but that's all available there for you in Silverlight. By the way, we are going to be focusing on Silverlight 3.0 today. That's the currently released version. And Silverlight 4 is already in beta, and perhaps that'll be a future webcast to focus on that. Just to talk for a second about this idea of XAML, the Extensible Application Markup Language. This is also used in Windows Presentation Foundation. And all it really is a declarative way of putting .NET objects into, of serializing .NET objects so that Silverlight can present them to people. So this is, you can see the code here. We have an example of some XAML code and the C# equivalent of that code. You might notice that the XAML is more concise, and you also could notice that it's something that we could easily separate from the application logic. Expression Blend is a great design tool for building out your XAML, and I'll show you how that integrates with Visual Studio as well. And that's a great way for your designers to build these rich UIs. When you're coding in Silverlight, you've got a subset of .NET. Some things that are conspicuous, perhaps in their absence. The XML document object model is missing. However, we have link to XML, which I personally find to be a lot better anyway. ADO.NET data is gone, although we do have ADO.NET data services, which can consume RESTful data interfaces to SharePoint or SQL Server. The array list is missing, but again, there's all kinds of generic collection types up there that you can use. A little caveat is that Silverlight projects can only reference Silverlight assemblies. So if you want to access some other objects, those also need to have been compiled for Silverlight in order for it to work. The networking in Silverlight is red style, meaning that all calls are asynchronous. So when you ask for some data, the next line of code is not going to be where you receive the data coming back to you. Rather, you're going to have an event handler of some sort that's going to get that data when it comes back. This is actually good because it forces good coding practices and keeping the user interface responsive throughout. And I'll show you some coding tricks that will make this pretty easy. And also, another little thing is that when you interact with the user interface, you have to be on a special user interface thread. And I'll again show you how to do that through something called the dispatcher in Silverlight. The development environment is Visual Studio 2010. Makes it very easy. The setup is basically to create a Visual Studio solution for your SharePoint project. You're going to make a solution for each WSP. So everyone should be developing for SharePoint. They should be building these web solution packages, which are now natively supported in Visual Studio 2010 and quite easy to create, even though they were kind of hard to create before. And then you're going to have a project for each Silverlight application, a project for the SharePoint solution, one or more, and use output references to copy the XAP files up into SharePoint. And I'll show you exactly how to do that. XAP, if you're not familiar, is the executable that Silverlight actually uses. So the Silverlight application is packaged inside of a ZAP file. And then there's a little Enable Silverlight Debugging checkbox, which I'll also show you, that you need to turn on in order to debug on the Silverlight side. Just to kind of demystify this, putting Silverlight onto a web page in SharePoint or elsewhere is extremely simple. It's just an object tag. There's no magic here. It's a well-documented structure, and really you can just put that on the page and get going with Silverlight pretty easily. So now I'm going to switch over to my demo machine, and what I'd like to show you is, as I said, I'm just going to start from scratch and go ahead and create a Silverlight solution in SharePoint. I do have a few code snippets because you probably don't want to watch me type. Only one of them is kind of long, but it should be pretty straightforward. So here we are in Visual Studio 2010, and the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and create a new project. And you'll notice that there's a whole bunch of new project types here for SharePoint 2010. I'm just going to go ahead and create an empty one, and we'll call that SL Demo. And so I'm actually starting on the SharePoint side rather than the Silverlight side because I really want to build a solution that's going to deploy my Silverlight application up to SharePoint. So I'm going to go ahead and pick a debugging site, and I'm going to deploy this as a sandbox solution. So if you're not familiar with sandbox solutions, these actually run in a sandbox on the server, which is great for allowing business users even to upload into a site collection a solution that can then run in a controlled environment. And I'll show you a little bit more about that later. But basically, that could be a talk unto itself. It's a very powerful thing. And I think that SharePoint sandbox solutions and Silverlight are a natural fit for each other. Now I'm going to go ahead and add an additional project to this, and that will be our Silverlight project. So I'll go ahead and make a Silverlight application. And go ahead and add that in, and it's going to Visual Studio is going to offer to create a little application for testing this, but I don't really want that. I'm going to shut that off. That would be a little website that would run in the Visual Studio web server. We don't really need that. So now here's my design surface for my main page in the Silverlight environment, and unlike earlier versions in Visual Studio 2008, I can now just go ahead and drag and drop right onto here. I don't have to do anything very fancy. Previously, this designer was read-only, so it would just show you what you had on the page, but you couldn't actually edit it, and now you can edit it very easily. Sometimes it's nice to edit the XAML directly, though, so I'm just going to come in here and edit the label on this button. And so a little reference to Douglas Adams there. We'll go ahead and ask people not to push the button, which will ensure that they, of course, push it. And then I'll go ahead and double-click and add an event handler. And go ahead and put that in, and that should be enough to actually get started. So let me build this, and what I'll show you is that we're going to end up with an XAP file at the end. So we'll just take a look at all files here in bin debug. There's hello silverlight.xap, which is a great start, but of course we need to get this up to SharePoint in order to use it. So to do that, I'm going to actually switch down here to my SharePoint solution, and I'm going to go ahead and create a module. So there's a couple of ways I could do this. What I'm going to do is create a SharePoint module, which is a deployment object that basically says I want to go ahead and deploy something up into SharePoint. And I'm going to call it client bin. You could use a mapped folder to do this, but the module has something special going for it, which is this thing called a project output reference, which you should be able to see me highlight here. The project output reference allows me to just go up and say, well, you know what? I want to actually deploy something that was an output of one of the other projects in my solution. So which project? Well, the Silverlight one. What kind of deployment do I want? Well, there's a bunch of choices. Because this is a sandbox solution, I can't choose a choice that would actually modify the web server file system. So I'm going to choose an element file, which will get ghosted into SharePoint's virtualized file system. So that's something that I can do easily inside of my sandbox solution. So now that's going to actually pull that in dynamically when I go ahead and build next time. I don't need the sample file, but I am going to go ahead and declare this inside the XML. So file path equals client bin / because I'm on the file system. And then the URL where I want it to appear up in SharePoint is going to be client bin / hello Silverlight. Okay, so that should be enough to get started. Oh, I think I need to close my XML tag there. And now let's go ahead and deploy that. And Visual Studio 2010 will fire up. Go ahead and create a WSP package, add that, deploy it, and now I should be able to go in, and of course a great way to see what's going on in that virtualized file system is to use SharePoint Designer. So that will take just a sec because Visual Studio just restarted my web application. So let me make sure that that's working. Yeah. Now if I come in here, I should be able to see there's my client bin, and you can see all my other ZAP files that I have for the other demos, as well as here's the new one that I just put in, hello Silverlight.zap. Okay, so I've got my my ZAP files deployed. Now let me go ahead and put this on the page. And so let's start by doing this kind of the easy way. I'm going to go ahead and use an out-of-the-box web part. SharePoint 2010 ships with Silverlight web part. I can go ahead and add that. And it's going to require the full path to the ZAP file. Okay. And so there we go. And we've got our little application here, and it works perfectly. So let's take this a little bit further, and what I'd like to do is actually pull in some data from SharePoint. This is pretty cool to be able to do this, but unless we just want some static content, we're going to have to go and get some information from somewhere. So to do that, I'm actually going to use the new client object model, which is included in SharePoint 2010. Now, my personal experience with this, and this may change in the final version because I'm still on a beta, is that in order to do this, I actually need to copy the DLLs for the client object model right into my project. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. I'm just making a folder. It doesn't really matter what I call it. And I'm going to go ahead and add some existing items. And I'm going to browse my way to what you might want to call the 14 hive. It's that same path we've used before, program files, common files, Microsoft shared, web server extensions, except now it ends in 14. We actually now call this the SharePoint root because we don't want to keep coming up with a new name for every version. We go into template layouts, and there's a client bin in here, and you can see in here the ZAP files, a couple of ZAP files that are used by SharePoint directly, and a couple of DLLs. So these are the client object model that has been compiled specifically for Silverlight. You'll get all kinds of strange errors if you try to use another one other than the Silverlight version. Now I need to go ahead and add references. So I'm going to go ahead and just browse over to that location and come in here to my project. And find those two files and add references to those. And that should be good enough to get me started on client object model programming. I'm going to go ahead and add a using statement. And that's about it. So now my first code snippet here is going to actually be to call the object model. And I'll walk you through the code. What I'm going to do is get a client context object. Then I'm going to go ahead and when somebody clicks the button, I'm going to go ahead and open that client context. Now, I'll show you later how to get rid of this hard-coded URL, right? There's a couple ways to do it. One is I could actually go ctx.current, client context, sorry, it's a static, .current, and get it that way. That would appear to work because I'm using the out-of-the-box SharePoint web part. The out-of-the-box SharePoint web part for Silverlight passes some parameters in which allow client context.current to work. But you know what? I want to be able to run this in my own web part. And so I'm actually not going to be able to use that because the parameters that get passed in don't seem to be documented just yet, at least. And so what we're going to do is explicitly open this on the URL. And I will show you, as I said in the next example, how to pass this in and generate this on the server side and pass it into Silverlight so that we don't have to hard code the URL. Then we're going to go ahead and load the web object. So this is the equivalent of an SP web object from the context. And what this is actually doing is that you actually get prototype objects at first when you use the client object model. This is to encourage you to not be too chatty. You can actually load up a lot of things, and then when you do one call to execute query async, and it will go fill in all those objects. So ctx.load of web, with the generic of web, is actually going to go ahead and fill in all the static properties of the web object. And of course, I have to call execute query async, which is going to call an event handler down here, and that event handler will have the completion. And of course, I'd love to just take the results and use them at that point, but I want to update the UI. And the UI, as I said, has to always be updated from the user interface thread inside of Silverlight. So there's a dispatcher that runs in the UI thread, and you can enqueue something very easily by calling dispatcher.beginInvoke. And so basically when that dispatcher runs over on the other thread, it's going to call this function, which is going to put the web title into that button. So now if I redeploy, I should be able to come here and refresh the page. And now when I click the button, I get the name of my site. Flip over to browse so you can see that. It's the name of the site. So that's all well and good. But now let me show you another way, a little bit more short code, more concise way to code this. Oops. So this is the same exact code, believe it or not. But here we're using something that was introduced, I think, in .NET 3.5 called a lambda expression. So what this is doing is it's basically saying, well, execute this asynchronous query, and when it completes, call an event handler, which is implemented here. So it's an anonymous function that I can put right in line, and it's going to generate that function, which has no name, doesn't need a name, and then it's going to pass the delegate to execute query async. And same thing here with dispatcher.beginInvoke. I don't need to give this function a name that does button1.content equals ctx.web. I can just make that an anonymous function, and I'll get the same exact results when I go ahead and run this. The reason I like it is it's less typing, and also it reads better. It's possible to just sort of read this from top to bottom. I can see that I'm getting an asynchronous response, excuse me, and then I'm marshalling across threads, but the code still reads kind of from top to bottom so I can see what's going on. So once again, not too thrilling, but I'm going to get the same results from this piece of code. So the last thing that I want to do in this demo is actually build a web part that will display this, because, you know, as nice as this is, having to go in and configure this Silverlight web part might not be what business users want to do. Maybe they actually just want to have a web part that does some function and put it directly on the page. So this will be a way of showing you all how to create a custom web part or something else that will render the Silverlight directly. So I'll create a new item. I'm going to start with just a class file, just a regular .NET class, and I'm going to call this Silverlight plugin.cs. It turns out that Silverlight 2.0 came with a class to do this, and I have no idea why it was removed from Silverlight 3, but I wrote my own. And so here it is. You can see I need to add a reference also to system.web as part of this. And that'll take care of, oh, come on, where are you? That'll take care of that, these couple errors that I have. So this is not rocket science, okay? There's a little bit of code here, but if you look at it, what it's doing is it's just going to go ahead and create a literal control that renders the object tag as we discussed. You can, if you want to know what that's supposed to look like, actually the Silverlight app will generate a test. Just go ahead and let it generate the test page for you, and you can pull it off of there. The only thing that I would point out here, of course, I'm passing in the source. That's my ZAP file, passing in some init params, which we're not going to use right here, but this is how you would pass information into Silverlight. And also up here, it's worth noting that I'm actually forcing a height and a width. So if somebody passes a height and width into me with my own properties, then I'm going to use that. Otherwise, I'm going to put some defaults in here. And I'm going to go ahead and on the object tag, I'm going to give it a height and width, as you can see here. If you don't do that and your Silverlight control is defined as being automatically sizing, it will automatically size to 0 by 0 pixels, and you won't see anything. And yet you won't get any errors, so you might find yourself scratching your head. So that's just something to kind of watch out for. So that is something, I'm going to actually use this exact same Silverlight plugin object in every one of my examples here. So we'll go ahead and squirrel that away. And now I'm going to go ahead and add another new item, which is going to be a web part. I would pick a visual web part, but those don't work in sandbox solutions. So because they have to write to the file system. So I'm just going to call this hello Silverlight WP, make a little web part. And this will be extremely simple. All I need to do is come in here and to create child controls and add a few lines of code. So this is just going to go ahead and instantiate my Silverlight object tag control, set the source to point to my ZAP file, and add that to the solution, or add that to my controls collection. But you know what? This might be a nice opportunity to show you the debugging experience. So I'm going to go ahead and do that too. I'm going to set a breakpoint here on the server, and then just to keep it interesting, I'm going to set one up here on the client, and then go ahead and hit the debug button. What's going to happen now is that Visual Studio is going to build this. It's going to deploy it. It's going to warn me that I'm connecting to the SharePoint worker process. And now, of course, it's not going to hit my web part or my breakpoint right now because I've still got that generic out-of-the-box web part here. So let me go ahead and swap that out. Of course, the client side should fire if I push the button, but I'll do that in a second. I'm just going to go ahead and add my custom web part. Here it is. Add that to the page. It automatically should know where my SAP file is, and it should just render it for me directly. And something's a little, oh, wait a minute. Yep, there we go. Okay, it's working. So here I am. I hit my breakpoint. I can walk through. I can do anything that you like to do in the debugger. Once this finishes, I come back out to my page. There's my button. I click the button, and for some reason we didn't hit the breakpoint here on the Silverlight side, but basically, oh, I know why. Let me show you. So this is another opportunity to show you something. It's not the most intuitive thing. Inside the SharePoint project, not the Silverlight project, on the SharePoint tab, because it's a SharePoint project that owns the debugger session, I need to go ahead and enable Silverlight debugging instead of script debugging. And I'll bet that was my problem. So let's go ahead and try that again. So as I say, it's a little counterintuitive just because you wouldn't think to edit. Oh, yeah. If you don't get it right the first time, you end up having to restart to get it to work properly. So I'm not sure if it's going to work for me this time. Let me just try it. Yeah, okay, so that worked on the server side. And now if I click the button, yep, okay, good, we're good. And now I can walk through this on the client side, so you can actually see what that debugging experience is like. So, it's great to be able to do this without having to manually attach the debugger, which I did about 800,000 times, I think, in SharePoint earlier versions. I can just click F5. So big time saver on that. The last thing I'll show before I go back to slides is I'm just going to go right into the web browser here and show you that sandbox solution. So this whole solution that we've just built is actually running here in the site collection as in the user solution gallery. So once again, this means that we can monitor its resource usage. If it overruns its quota of 300 server resource units, it will be shut down. So this means that if I wanted to deploy this in a hosted environment or somewhere where I'm sharing the server, maybe a business user wants to be able to do this, they can upload this without having to go talk to a server admin, assuming that the server admin has enabled the sandbox solutions, of course. All right, so let's go back to the slides and go into our next example. So there's many ways to access the SharePoint content itself from Silverlight. And we just saw the first and probably most popular one in SharePoint 2010, which is to use that client object model. Another option is to use ADO.NET Data Services, which is our RESTful interface to lists, and I'll show you that in a second. Another is to call the SharePoint Web Services APIs. Those are great, but they don't do everything. So the client object model is sort of intended to be an all-encompassing object model that is for general use. The SharePoint Web Services API is pretty much designed to support clients like Office. So things that you would want to do from a program like Word or Outlook are in there, but it's not necessarily going to do everything that you want it to. So again, that you can kind of look there and see if it does what you need. You could always develop a custom web service. And again, another option is to pass data on the HTML page, and that's actually the first example that we're going to see. So the demo I just did, basically, if you think about it from an interaction point of view, our user went and browsed on a page and got back a response. The response rendered in the web browser, and it had an object tag on it. The object tag had a Silverlight plugin, which then loaded the Silverlight application. And then the second that Silverlight application started to run, well, actually I had to push the button, but often I've seen people do this where you don't even push a button. The very first thing it does, rush back to the server and get some data to render. So if this was on a high volume server, if this was on the home page of a .com site or a large intranet site, I would just, by putting that web part on there, I would have increased my server traffic significantly. And so my question is, do we really need that extra server round trip? So this brings us to the next agenda topic, which is how can we reduce round trips using the HTML bridge for Silverlight? So we're going to take a different approach here, where we're going to get the page, and we're going to actually pass some data back on the page. So it's not just the page content, but it's actually some data along with it. Then we're going to go ahead and load the Silverlight app, and all it has to do is go back to the web browser, which is virtually free on the client, and pull that data in. The Silverlight HTML bridge is your friend. It's a very powerful piece of technology. It allows you to access the whole HTML document object model, which you may have used in Ajax programming directly from Silverlight. You can call JavaScript from Silverlight. You can call Silverlight from JavaScript. Event handlers work both ways. Silverlight types can be passed back and forth. So there's really a whole lot of things you can do with this HTML bridge. The example I'm going to show you now is a picture viewer web part, very popular use case, I suppose. Pointed at a picture library or image library in SharePoint. and it's going to go ahead and render that as a slideshow. So the way it works is that there are actually, the web part's going to put that object tag on the page, of course. It's also going to put a hidden form field containing the URLs of all the pictures to be rendered. And it'll put that in a hidden form field so that Silverlight can then come along. We pass it the name of that hidden field, and then it can use the HTML bridge to read that data in and provide a little bit more of an efficient UI. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at that. Switch back to demo mode. And actually, let's start by looking at the solution, at the finished solution. So here's the web page, and it may take a second to. You're not going to get all the nice fades and animations, but if you were not on a live meeting with 100 of your closest friends, you might notice that the control panel fades in and out when I mouse over the control, and I can easily move and see all these flowers from my wife's garden. She has a really nice garden. And I can throw it into slideshow mode, and it'll cycle through the pictures. And so let's go ahead and see how that works. Before I look at the code, before I show you the code, let's just do a view source on the page. And I'm just going to search for .xap, and that'll be sure to find our Silverlight piece right here. So here's the object tag, and with my picture view.xap. And you'll see here that there's this parameter that we passed in called a init params. A init params is the sort of first line way of passing information to Silverlight. And all you do is put a comma separated list of name value pairs. So in this case, input control ID equals blah, blah, blah. That's the ID of the hidden form field. If I go up a little bit, we can find that control is right here. Here it is. Input name equals. There's the same ID, and then inside is some HTML encoded XML with the names of the paths of all those pictures on it. Notice that, Silverlight doesn't inherently know where it is. Like if you're on a web page, you can use relative URLs that are relative to the web page, or even just starting from the root of the server. Silverlight doesn't really understand that. You can get that information through the HTML bridge and use it programmatically, but normally it's going to want a full path, a full URL to any resources that it's going to get at over the network. So if we go into the code, I'll show you how this thing works. So I've got, here's the picture view application, and if I open this up, you'll see it here on the design surface. And so you can see it's a little bit more complicated than the previous one. What's interesting is if you look at the code, there's a lot of stuff going on, including animations for all the fades. I actually have two images, so there's a main and an alternative image, and then there are storyboards that will fade, that will provide little animations to fade between the two images. So I didn't build that all by hand. I used Expression Blend. So Expression Blend and Visual Studio know how to play nice together. And so here I can just open this up in Expression Blend. Only problem is that Expression Blend 3 doesn't know about Visual Studio 2010 because Visual Studio came along after that. So, well, I'm going to get the security warning. That's fine. Then it's going to say that my solution file is not in a supported format. But I'm brave. I'll say yes. Go ahead and try to open it. And then I get a nice fat error in my face saying, well, I couldn't do that. So you might think that I was out of luck, but no, actually, just because it can't open the solution file doesn't mean I can't use Blend here. It's still going to open up my XAML file and let me go ahead and have this much richer editing experience. And for instance, I can do things like actually open up those storyboards and see, gosh, when the controls fade in, for instance, this is the control and how it fades in over a timeline. This is kind of uses a recording metaphor, so you can actually move things around on the screen, associate them with the timeline, and make animations. Very cool. If I were to modify this, Visual Studio would just give me that little message that you sometimes get that says, that the file was edited outside of the editor, and it'll reload it for me. So those two tools play very well together, and I often will run with both of them open at the same time, and I haven't had any problems, even when editing the same file with both tools. So now that I've got my my little user interface built, let's take a look at the web part that's going to host it. Here's my web part, and I'm going to pass in wrong web part. Hang on. Here's my web part. That's the next one. And I'm going to pass in the name of the library that we're going to show, that we're going to render. And then here in my code, what we're going to do is, first of all, build the server URL so that we can take the path names to our images and make them fully qualified. And then we're going to go ahead and build out that hidden form field. And you can see the XML format that I chose. We'll go ahead and use one of the HTML controls. We usually use web control, things that are derived from web control. But there's another set of controls called the HTML controls. And one of them is this hidden input field. So that's a very handy way to do this. And I'm just going to go ahead and open up that picture library as an SP list, and then enumerate the list. And this is a little piece of link for XML. You can see that I'm actually building out the XML here. Personally, I like this better than the XML DOM because you notice that the structure of the code actually mirrors the structure of the XML, whereas with the XML DOM, you sort of start at the middle and work your way out. So this is a lot, I think, clearer. And then I can go ahead and inject that XML into my input control. Drop the Silverlight control on the page. This height and width thing is here because I found that if I don't make the Silverlight a tiny bit smaller than my hosting control, that I was getting scroll bars. And then here's then init param. So we're going to go ahead and pass. Notice it's not the ID, but the client ID, which .NET hands to you. So it dynamically generated that, and that's going to be the client, the object ID on the client side, which I need to pick up inside of my Silverlight code. So now if we go into Silverlight, what you'll see is I'm going to start here in my application startup routine, and because that's where we can get at the init params. So the initial parameters get passed in as part of the event arguments for the startup event. And I'm going to go ahead and pull in this input control ID, and assuming it's there, I'm going to pass it in to a method called read input. And if we go ahead and take a look at that, you'll see that what it's going to do is it now knows the control ID. So here's my HTML document. This, by the way, is part of system.windows.browser. Okay, so you want to go ahead and add that namespace, and then you can come right in here and grab that HTML page.document. That is the same document object that you would see on the web browser document object, the HTML DOM document object. So now I can go ahead and get an element by ID, grab the value, and now I'm going to have my XML string, which I can then go ahead and use that to build out a collection of picture items which just have names and URLs in them. So the rest of the code is basically all about rendering these images, and it gets a little bit interesting here. I've got three states. Either nothing was displaying before, the main image, or the alternate image was displaying before. So when display image gets called in response to somebody clicking on one of the buttons or the timer going off for that slideshow view, what it's going to do is go ahead and pull in the bitmap image of my picture based on the URL, and it's going to go ahead and display that in either the main image or the alternative image, and it's going to go ahead and run the animation, either to fade it in at the beginning, or to fade between main and alt, or to fade between alt and main. And then the last little piece of code here is the timer for the slideshow mode. And it's pretty straightforward. I guess the only thing that's kind of interesting, if you will, is that this timer is actually called the dispatcher timer. So if I look at the timer object, you'll notice that it's of type dispatcher timer. What that means is that this timer actually doesn't call my callback function or fire my event on any old thread. It uses that user interface thread dispatcher to do it. So that means I don't have to go and do a begin invoke and switch over to the UI thread. When the timer ticks, I'm all ready to go. So just a quick example to show how you can eliminate those round trips by stuffing the data that you need right into a hidden field on the form and getting it directly. Excuse me. So my next demo is actually going to be talking about how to work with large data sets. This is sort of a perennial challenge. If we try to download too much data, then we get a really slow and unresponsive user interface. And you know what? It also tends to overwhelm the user. So we really don't want to overwhelm the user with all that data. They really can only consume little chunks of data just as the web browser can. So the solution to this is really to only load what the user needs to see at any given time. We're going to allow the user to go ahead and query, page through the information, etc. In doing this, the RESTful interface, ADO.NET Data Services, is your friend. ADO.NET Data Services allows paging so that we can actually request specific sets of rows from the middle of the data set. And so that's a great way to implement this without a whole lot of extra coding. So now what the interaction is going to look like is I'm going to go ahead and get my page, read the initial data off the page. I'm still going to use that other pattern. Maybe this data is going to be on the home page, and I'm going to show the first several rows of data right on the home page of my website. Most users probably aren't going to click on it. Why should I have extra round trips to go in and retrieve that data? On the other hand, once they actually click on something and they want more data, then I'm going to go ahead and use ADO.NET Data Services to update the display. So my web part is actually showing a specific list. It's going to go ahead and pass in some initial data, as I said, with the object tag. Silverlight pulls in the initial data and renders it, and then when the browse happens, it pulls more data from the list data service. So let's go ahead and see that in action. Okay, so here's go back to the web browser, and we'll take a look at this. So here's my solution. This is using some data. It's not a huge data set, but it's 270 odd rows, and I've only downloaded the first 10. This is the population of the largest 100 metro areas in the United States. So it's nice and handy. Download from the U.S. Census Department. And you can see, notice down here at the bottom that it's telling me that there's one page in cache, and that so far I've made 0 calls to the list data service, to that RESTful service. Now if I click the next button, I now have 2 pages in cache, and I've made 1 call to the list data service, etc. I can page through this. If I go backwards, I don't update the cache or call list data service. I'm actually just displaying these pages out of cache. Now I can also click on one of the headings and sort it by name, and I had to do another call. I basically flushed the cache and made another call to list data services in order to do that. Right. I can also filter, so maybe I want all cities with the word new in them. And notice that I have to pause for a second before that happens. Okay, the SharePoint conference where I showed this before was in Vegas, so there's Las Vegas. Lots of people are in Seattle. So you kind of get the idea of how this works. So to take a look at this, let me actually, before I show you the code, let me show you the RESTful data service. So if I go into vti-bin/listdata.svc, special kudos to anyone who can tell me what VTI stands for. I do know the answer. It's a trivia question. VTI-bin/listdata.svc will return me a XML representation of all the lists inside this site. And here's the one I want, is metro areas. So I can go ahead and just put that /metro areas. Now I'm going to get back those metro areas. And notice that there's 273 of them. So I've got the whole list coming down to me. And it's actually coming down in Atom format. Excuse me, I meant to do resource. So here's all the data. Here's all the content right there. And in fact, I can now come in here. Maybe I want to just look at the top few rows. So let's say $top equals 10. Now notice that I've only got 10 rows. And here they are. Maybe I want to skip the second page of 10. So I can just skip those and get the next 10 and on and on. So essentially, this is what we're going to do from our Silverlight application. In order to pull this data, there's also an order by and a filter fragment that I can put on, or query string argument that I can put on there to get those functions to work. So I'm going to go right straight to the Silverlight side. You'll have to trust me that I packaged up the first page of data and sent it in with XML. And so here's where we're going to go ahead and read that in and bind that into an observable collection for the data grid to display. It gets a little bit more interesting if we start looking at how do we update this. So I actually have some fields here that are going to keep the current filter, the current order by, and the current page number. So as I move around, actually all we're going to do is update these fields, and then when it displays, it's actually going to use that to construct the correct query to ADO.NET Data Services. So here's display page, and this method gets called whenever anybody clicks on any of the headers or buttons, and it's basically going to know what page number it's supposed to display. And all we do here is we go ahead and make a data context, okay? So notice we had the site URL. That actually got passed in using an init param. So that's really the way to do that. I mentioned that earlier. I'll show you later in a client object model example. But you can just pass that in as an init param from your web part and get that in there. And then we go ahead and use list data service. And the first thing we'll try to do is display this from cache. And I'll show you the caching logic later, but if we couldn't display it from cache, then we have to go ahead and get some data. So we'll figure out what the first row was based on the page size and the page number we've been asked. And then we're going to go ahead and make this query and go ahead and specify the top, how many we're skipping, the order by based on that order by field, and the filter based on the filter field. The filter's the most complex one because I've got some logic in there that waits for you to actually stop typing for a quarter of a second so that it won't issue a call back to the server every single character that you type. And that's just going to fit the filter field, and then we go ahead and construct this format that will filter both the name of the city and the state that it might be in. And then go ahead and begin the execution of this. So once again, this is an asynchronous call. So we're not really going to get our data back right away. Instead, we're going to go ahead and call onQueryComplete, which is going to marshal itself over to the dispatcher. So using that Lambda expression again. And here you can see what we're going to do is go ahead and take that information that we get back from the query and the execution, close that out, and then go ahead and enumerate the items in the list. Now, this was all generated by Visual Studio, so this is an interesting caveat here. It's a good thing and it's a caveat at the same time. Here's my metro areas list. So Visual Studio actually generated the object model for this. And so as a result, this particular solution can only display this one type of list. So if this were a production solution, I would want to put the list definition right into my solution so that it would always match the object model that I was using here. Now I can go ahead and add the metro areas to my binding collection and bind those up to the grid for display. Sorting and paging, pretty simple. All I have to do is set those fields that I mentioned. So when somebody clicks on a heading, we're just going to go ahead and set the order by, clear the cache, and display page 0. Same thing with the paging buttons. We just have to display the previous or the next page. And the filter is kind of the most interesting one. This next piece of logic just does things like dim the button when you get to the end of a list, when you get to the last page, so you can't go beyond the last page, that sort of thing. Filtering is a little bit more complex because of that timer. So here's that timer again. We're just going to go ahead and have that fire every 250 milliseconds. And then when a keystroke happens, we're going to restart the timer. Basically, if it was enabled, we stop it, and we start it again, and make sure that we've got at least 3 characters to filter on. And then when the timer actually ticks, that would only happen if somebody has typed but not typed anything new for a quarter of a second. And at that point, I can take that filter text and pass that in on my filter field and display the page, clear the cache, and I'm good to go. Finally, my caching logic, pretty simple. The cache is a dictionary, so it's a generic indexed by integer and containing a observable collection of metro area items. And all we're going to do is just check to see if it contains the page, and if it does, then we just go ahead and bind the observable collection to the grid. If not, we return false, and then you saw up earlier in the code that that's going to cause it to go out and get some fresh data. And then adding to the cache, clearing to the cache are just the simple dictionary operations. So that's how that works. The nice thing is that this would work with SQL Server or other data sources as well that support ADO.NET data services. So it's a nice flexible way to work. What's interesting also is that even if I was in a sandbox solution where I might not have access to that SQL data, I could still access it from Silverlight. So that's why I think Silverlight and sandbox solutions are going to be really work really well together. Also, of course, I have the client to do the authentication directly from the web browser, for better or worse, depending on my situation. And I have a nice, rich, multi-threaded UI. The only caveat is if I ever want to do cross-domain access. What I'm talking about here is actually the DNS domain of the website. If my page is on foo.com and I want to access a data source on bar.com, out of the box, I can't do it. And this is because of the possibility of cross-server Silverlight attacks or scripting attacks. The same as cross-site scripting attack. We needed to prevent those. So there's 3 ways to get around this. The first one is to go ahead and put a file in place on your web on the server that has the data in it. That is called client access policy.xml, and if you bing on that, you'll get the details on how to fill that in. Adobe Flash has the exact same situation. They have a file that they call crossdomain.xml. Silverlight will respect the Flash version of this file. So if you want to go after some RSS content or some content on some other public server, if it's already set up for Flash, you can access it from Silverlight. So that's one option. Another option is to use a proxy server. So there are third-party proxies out there that are intended to aggregate data. For instance, RSS aggregators will do this. If they have the necessary policy files, you could use those in front of the content that you want to render. Another option would be to write your own proxy and put it in your domain, perhaps right on your SharePoint server. For instance, you could write a custom web service that runs in SharePoint that reaches out to the back end and pulls in the data and relays it back to Silverlight. So it's more work, but now you're getting around the problem by basically having the data appear to be in your domain, and you're also staying secure because, of course, you're going to be brokering all those requests. Yet another option is to let the web browser do it. So you can always use the JavaScript bridge to retrieve external data, and then the web browser is accessing it instead of Silverlight. Sounds like a great idea, except guess what? The web browser has the exact same security concern, and so you're going to be subject to your browser's cross-domain policy. And all of the major browsers have this disabled by default. So either you're going to have your users lower their security settings, or you're going to have to figure out for each browser how to allow that cross-domain access to happen. So I just wanted to kind of give you the skinny on how to handle this when your data source is external to SharePoint. And once again, note that this is only an issue if your DNS domain is different. So if you have a different server in the same DNS domain, you're not going to run into that problem. Okay, so the next example is a field control. And I like to point this out because not a lot of people even know that they can build a field control. And it's a really neat way to extend SharePoint. Basically, field controls render a specific type of field. So we're actually going to add a new data type to SharePoint and make a Silverlight field control that renders it. This can be used primarily in web content management pages, but it also is useful on list views. And a field control, therefore, has two modes, actually three. So it has a display view so that you can view the field. It has an authoring and editing view so that you can edit the field. And then it has a design view, which is used currently in SharePoint Designer, so that if you're putting the fields onto a web content management page, we have, SharePoint Designer isn't going to be able to render Silverlight, so we need to put something there so that in SharePoint Designer we can see where we're putting it. And Silverlight field controls allow this kind of rich interaction without the user having to place web parts on the page. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but here's my little comparison of field controls and web parts. A couple of noticeable things is that field controls get versioned with the page, whereas web parts do not. Web parts get approved with the page, but they don't actually get, because they're stored in the web parts store and not in the page object, they don't actually get versioned with the page. Another thing to kind of notice about this is that content management scenario, you can fix the location of your field controls and have a more controlled authoring environment. Whereas generally web parts you can put in web part zones and move them around any which way you like, which is great in some scenarios, but if you had a web publishing scenario, you might want to lock that down. So that's a couple of the trade-offs. Part of the reason I show this is because it actually introduces another pattern for interaction. Here the user has gone ahead and rendered our plugin and our little Silverlight application. And so imagine now that I'm actually editing the field, and either on the property page or on a web content management page. Get the same situation with an editor part if I'm going to go ahead and use Silverlight to edit a web part over in the little flyout on the right, or if I was to use it in a custom application page. The issue is I don't really want to update SharePoint directly from Silverlight, because if I did, users really expect to be able to hit cancel and back out of the change on behalf of all the fields, not just your field, or they want to be able to click OK and persist all the fields in a transactional manner. They do not want this one field to go ahead and update in real time and then have all the other fields update when the page gets posted back. So the solution is to don't write your data back to SharePoint, instead write it back into the web browser into an HTML field. And then when the whole page, when the user hits save and posts back the whole page, and then it all goes to SharePoint in one unit so that the user gets that expected experience. What I'll show now is a video field control. And basically, this consists of two Silverlight apps, one for displaying the videos and one for selecting a different video if you want to when you're in editing mode. And we use the client object model to actually provide a little browsing experience to go ahead and locate a video that we'd like to show. And I'll apologize in advance. I'm not sure how this is going to render in live meeting because I actually have live videos running here. But what I'll do is try to pause them quickly so that it won't fill up the pipe with all that video data coming down. So here's my page, and you can see here I've got a little video playing with a mobile phone in it. If I go ahead and edit the page, it's going to flip into edit view, and now you can see the other Silverlight application, which is actually going to allow me to choose which video I would like. So let me go to a different site, and notice that now my library and document dropdowns have been cleared out. I want to come in here and grab an industry video, and let's look at the retail video, retail pharma video. And so we can go ahead and do that. If I click save, then it's going to go ahead and start displaying that video when I go back to my page. But you don't have to use this really in a web content management scenario. If I go into all site content, I'll show you that the same exact field control can be used in any list, and I'll do this by just editing the properties of my page. If I view the properties, I'm going to get a display of all the fields. When I scroll down, there's my video, okay? So the video field is just automatically rendered that way by SharePoint. If I edit the item, then I'm going to get the selector, just like before, where I can come in here and select a video. Let's try a different one. Notice now that if I just change the document library, I'm actually going to get a different list of videos to pick from. Okay, so that's how that works. And now if I go back to the page again, I should get that video, right? So you can see how that all fits together. So now back into Visual Studio, and we'll take a peek at the code for this. I just want to be mindful of the time here. I'm going to need to pick this up just a little bit, but basically my field control is here. And the first thing that I'll show you is that I actually have a field definition. So this is where I'm actually declaring a video field into SharePoint. So I'm deriving this from a text field. So it really is nothing more than a piece of text. And the thing that's interesting is that I'm actually going to go ahead and tell SharePoint I'm going to override this one property which SharePoint uses to get the control that's used to render and edit this field, and I'm going to give it my control and override the one that it got from the text field. Then those controls are here, so I've got one for the display side, and what that's going to do is come in here and create child controls. It's now going to look at the mode, and it's going to do something different if I'm in display mode or edit mode. If I'm in display mode, it's going to go ahead and put that Silverlight application on the screen to display this, and it's going to pass in the URL of the video as an initial parameter. It's just coming right out of the field on the, that SharePoint is providing to me as a field control. I get past this value. When I render, this is something I sort of discovered through trial and error. When I render, once again, remember, I have to actually create a container for this that has some height and width, or I'm going to have that 0 by 0 problem again. So here in the render, we're going to go ahead and we'll let the Silverlight render itself when the time comes, but we're going to wrap that in a div tag that has some height and width to it. And we're also going to check and see if we're in design mode and output some just vanilla HTML here for SharePoint Designer to render. If I'm in input mode, then I'm going to go ahead and render this other helper control, which is here for my video selector. So this is a little bit complicated by the fact that SharePoint has the ability to set up an ASCX file or user control to override a field. And so I'm actually checking for that, and I'm going to go ahead and honor that. If a template like that has been declared, then I'll go ahead and run the template. Otherwise, I'm going to render my own control which I'm not going to bother to show you. It's a very simple Silverlight rendering of the video selector. What I'd rather do with our time that we have left here is show you that editor in the Silverlight side, because it has some interesting uses excuse me, of the client object model. When somebody changes the site that they've selected using the drop-down for site, it's actually going to call this event handler, which is actually going to come in and stop the preview video, and then it's going to go ahead and create a new client context. The URL, once again, is being passed into us in an init param, so we have that available. And then here's a link query. It's actually going to go ahead and query the web and get all of its lists that are not hidden. Now what I want to do, and I just haven't defined in the SDK for the beta, what list template type is for an media asset library. So it works with a picture library, but I commented it out because I wanted my media asset libraries to show. So that's why in my drop-down list I have all those libraries that perhaps I didn't need, something to take care of later. And then we go ahead and execute that, and if it succeeds, then this event handler will be called, which will go ahead and enumerate. So at this point, the site collection has been filled in. I now have my site list collection, and I can go ahead and enumerate that and bind that into my library combo box. Similarly, when somebody picks a different library, in that combo box, I need to give the user a different list of videos to select from. So pretty similar code here with the client object model. What's kind of cool about this is now I'm going to actually enumerate the items in that list. And you can see here that I actually have a camel query embedded inside of this link query. Kind of unexpected. I'm just really using this all items query here, so I'm not really using this. But if I wanted to, I could actually insert camel code in here. So I can sort of blend link and camel, which is pretty amazing. And then when that query completes, I come down here and actually bind that list of documents to that particular combo box. So just sort of a peek at how some of this works. I'm not going to have time to go through all of the code, but hopefully that gives you an idea of how to build a field control, and also some of the different ways of using the client object model. So what I want to do as sort of to wrap things up here is show you this web part connection scenario. What this is going to do is it's going to use the server-side web part connections that are built into SharePoint. Users know how to do this. They know how to connect web parts using those web part connections. The only disappointment of them, if you will, is that in order for the data to move between the web parts that are connected in this way, we have to do a page refresh. And what I want is I want the Silverlight apps to talk to each other without a page refresh. So what we're going to do is use the SharePoint server-side connection to broker a direct client-side connection. So I've got two web parts on the page. The first one is going to connect to the second, and the second one is then going to register itself, passing a unique value, which I use the client object ID, because that's always going to be unique on the page. And it's going to register itself with that first web part. Then both web parts launch a Silverlight application. The source application gets past the client ID which ends up being the mailbox that it's going to send to in the second application. So now, as data changes, it can just go ahead and send messages over to that second application. So this will be a little bit clearer when we take a look at the code. So let me start off again with a demo of the finished solution. So here are my parts, and you can see here is the source, and I've got two targets. This one's already connected, and the second one is not. So I'll use that as an opportunity to connect it. Notice that I don't see any connection stuff here, so I could edit the page. There's another thing to watch out for so you don't get confused. I edit the page, and I still can't connect them. So you might think, gosh, I can't connect them. Nope, all you have to do is edit the web part. And inside the editing screen, now it's going to let me connect. And I'm going to send my Silverlight provider to the other target now. It's already connected to the other one. And there we go. We'll go ahead and now they'll both say that they're connected. This is a very simple example. All I have to do now is, and I'll save the page for good measure. All I have to do now is go ahead and type something into one, well, you get the idea, and it shows up. And so it's a pretty simple thing. You'll see that the code is actually quite brief to do this, and I'm hoping that this is helpful for people who want to build some more complex scenarios. One of the really cool things about SharePoint web part connections is that you can define your own connection types. So that's what this little interface is about. So Silverlight connection, I actually made it up myself. It's very simple. All it does is register a receiver, and you can pass any name you want as long as it's unique on the page. So this is going to be used. Anybody who consumes this connection is going to either have to provide a register receiver or call register receiver. So if I go into my connection source web part, you'll see that actually is what's going to happen here. So we derive from a web part and from the Silverlight connection, and that means that we have to go ahead and register and provide this register receiver method. And what that's going to do is it's going to make sure that it has its children all created before we start, and then it's going to go ahead and create the Silverlight app. It's going to pass in whatever you register on the init params. And if several web parts register themselves, it just separates them all with semicolons. And we'll see when we look at the Silverlight code how it's actually going to parse that out and send all those little messages out. The target is sort of going to do the opposite of that. So that's going to go ahead and notice that it does not derive from that connection object, but it goes ahead and if it gets a connection from an Silverlight connection, what it's going to do is it's going to register itself using its own client ID as a unique identifier. And then it's going to pass that same ID to its little Silverlight application so that it can go ahead and receive on that particular ID. The rest of these web parts is real simple. It's just going to go ahead, pretty much like the Hello World one that I started with, and render those Silverlight applications. So let's take a look at the Silverlight side. My connection source is going, well, basically what we're using here is a feature in Silverlight 3, which is a system.windows.messaging namespace that allows me to send messages between Silverlight applications. You can see there's not a lot of code here. So when somebody types something, key goes up. I go through that receiver string. It's got a bunch of receiver names that I get passed in via init params, separated by semicolons. We're going to go ahead and walk through those, and every single one of those we're just going to send a message to. And I don't really need to even wait for the response in this case. And we're going to send the entire contents of that text box through. On the receiver side, as you might imagine, we're just going to sort of get the opposite, and it's going to go ahead and take this receiver. Now, I kind of went a little crazy with the lambda expressions here, so bear with me. What it's doing here is it's actually saying, well, I want to create a message received event. Rather than write a separate event handler, here's my event handler as an anonymous function. So there's the sender and the event args. And when I get called, it's going to call this anonymous function, which is going to have its own lambda expression to move itself over to the dispatcher. And then it's going to go ahead and set the message text box to the message. So I think this is really cool that I can do that. I can even take the event args that I get in, and it'll pass right into this this other anonymous function automatically for me. I don't have to do anything. I don't have to give them names or anything like that. The only thing I have to do is I have to remember to turn on the listener, because these receivers will only listen if you call listen, and then that's it. That's the entire thing. Extremely simple, and yet a lot of potential to do some interesting things with that. So that's it for the talk. I'll be open for questions. We've got about 10 minutes. If you want to go ahead and type in some questions, I'll go ahead and respond to those in voice. Or if if you want to ask a question later, that's fine too, and I'll go ahead and type those in after the live meeting ends. In summary, I just want to remind you that it's really not rocket science. It only takes an object tag to put Silverlight in SharePoint. There's all these other great tools that are available, but don't be shy about getting started with this. It's really just an object tag. Use the HTML bridge to reduce round trips, and be smart about when you want to send things directly to the server, or perhaps post them back via the HTML form that you're on. You want to go ahead and allow the user browsing to trigger accessing only the data you need in the case of a large data set. And finally, you can go ahead and make mashups with connected web parts. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending. I really appreciate it. Hope this was helpful to you. And I don't see any questions, so I guess we give you guys back 8 minutes of your day. We're ending just a little bit early. So thanks again.
Okay, before you all go, I do want to, if you do have questions, we'll give you one final call for that. I'm going to put up a survey slide now. We'll leave this up for the remainder. If you could just fill it out, take some time to fill it out, that would be wonderful. You'll notice there are two options, registered online and all other registrants. Just select the one that applies to you. And we'll be getting to questions in just a moment. Bob, I think if you hit the Q&A tab and there's the Manage tab, you'll see there are. Or perhaps you got to some of these already.
Okay. So do I have my virtual machine running on a 32-bit computer? No, I'm using a Hyper-V machine with 64-bit. So SharePoint 2010 is 64-bit only. And so the interesting option that was added there is that you can actually run it directly on 64-bit Windows Vista or Windows 7 client computers in developer scenarios where you don't want to use a server. Shane, a big call out to Shane W., who knew the answer to my trivia question. VTI stands for Vermeer Technologies, Inc., which was the company that originated the front page product. It was acquired by Microsoft, and it still lives on in what's become the SharePoint server extension, or the front page server extensions as they show up in SharePoint. Code samples, I will work on that. They're not out there right now. I would say take a look at, I know I'm kind of overdue in doing this, but I will put them out there at some point on my blog, which is blogs.msdn.com/Bob German. So take a look for that. If you just subscribe to the blog, I'll try to get those out there. I had some cleanup to do after the SharePoint conference and still didn't get it out there, so I apologize for that. Can you do this or part of it in MOS 2007? The answer is yes. You don't get the client object model or the RESTful access, but you can still certainly put Silverlight on the page. I actually, on my same blog, I have a write-up on how to do that. There are some changes you have to make to web.config in 2007 that you don't have to make in 2010 because MOS 2007, because SharePoint 2010 already has those in there because it uses Silverlight as well. So the other thing is that you tend to access the SharePoint data either using the built-in web services APIs or by writing your own web services. Any concerns with security around safe controls, and I'm trying to read the whole thing, or the client API. So the Visual, actually I had marked all these things as safe controls, and the nice thing is that Visual Studio did all of it for me. So Visual Studio generated a key, signed the assembly, and registered the safe controls entry in my web.config as part of the deployment package. And you didn't even notice because it was all done automatically for me by Visual Studio. So otherwise, for the client side, you're not going to have to mark that as a safe control or anything like that. And the client-side API has security built into it. So you'll find that you can only access a subset of the SharePoint API, and all the normal security is going to apply. So it's going to actually it's going to authenticate the user, using Windows authentication when you go in there and apply security at that point. So lots of requests for the demo code. So we'll work on that. Somebody asked where they can get the video again. I don't know if you can comment on that, Eric.
For the on-demand, if you registered for this webcast, yeah, you will be able to view the on-demand with that same URL you used to register. It will redirect to the on-demand, or you can just check back tomorrow, Microsoft.com/webcast, and check on-demand webcast, and you'll be finding this one up there.
Right. Okay. Good. Somebody noticed that I said client access policy.xml, and the slide said content access policy.xml. I'll double check that. I frankly don't remember whether it was a typo on the slide or a typo in my brain when I read the slide, but good catch on that. Thank you very much. Resources for developing SharePoint web parts using Silverlight. There are some articles out there on the web. There's also a book out, and actually for the person who asked about 2007, this is going to be a good resource for you. There's a book out there by Steve Fox and Paul Stubbs. It's a rocks book, and I don't have the title off the top of my head, but it's something like Developing SharePoint Solutions in Silverlight. It is intended for March 2007 and Silverlight 2.0. So that's the only caveat. It's a great resource, and that's how I got started in this development myself. So I think that's a great resource for you to know about. And let's see, there was a question about BCS that I don't know the answer to, so I'm going to have to get back to you on that. And my blog address again, let me, Eric, can I put that somewhere, or I just get the survey
You
running?
can reply all with the address, your blog address in there, and everybody will be able to copy and paste that URL into their browser.
Okay. So I'm going to try to send this out to everybody who asked. But if you didn't ask and you're just sitting there wondering, the answer is blogs.msdn.com/Bob German, BOBGERMAN. Oops. Sorry, I guess I'm being a little bit live meeting challenged on sending that out, but I will figure it out. And I'm trying to also look at the same time. I think I hit all these questions, but if I miss your question, you can also post something on my blog, and let's see if it's going to let me respond now. Okay. So now everybody who had a question outstanding should have the blog address there. And yes, you can run SharePoint 2010 on your client OS or Windows 7. The features, as far as I know, it is full featured. There are some articles if you go out and search the web on how to set this up. It is not the most straightforward thing in the beta. There's this thing called the prerequisite installer that ships with SharePoint 2010. It's really cool. It just runs and figures out what you need, and then you just click a button to go ahead and install all the prerequisites. That's the good news. The bad news is that that does not yet work in Windows 7 or Vista, so you have to hand install all the prerequisites before you do the install onto those operating systems. Otherwise, I don't know of any caveat from that. So As far as I can tell, that's it for the questions. And when not to use Silverlight, I think the biggest reason not to use Silverlight might be if you are if you don't have any way for your clients to get the Silverlight plugin. So if you're really in a situation where you don't think people are going to have the plugin, maybe desktops are locked down, that kind of a thing, then you might want to use Ajax or some other plugin technology. The nice thing about Silverlight, though, is that you can push it out with Windows Update or WSUS services. And SharePoint 2010 uses Silverlight, so I think you'll find that a lot of people who use SharePoint 2010 are going to want to make sure that they have Silverlight. It's rather nice in that it gracefully degrades, so if you don't have Silverlight, you don't get a download Silverlight link. In general, what you get is some other way of rendering the same content. And there might be a little notation saying, hey, this would look a little better if you had Silverlight, but here it is, because we understand that in some environments people don't have the permission to install anything on their desktop. You can do that in your solutions too, by the way. If you go back to the deck on the object tag, it shows where you would plug in some HTML to be rendered in the event that you do not have Silverlight available to you. So that's it. I think we've kind of are at the end of our time. So I'd like to once again thank everyone for attending this webcast, and I will redouble my efforts to find time to get this code packaged up and out on my blog. Based on that being the most frequent question, I get the message loud and clear that people could use those samples. So thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Thank you for presenting today, and thank everyone for attending today's webcast. That concludes today's MSDN webcast. You may now disconnect from the audio portion of this conference.